I'm using 3 different size popsicle sticks to make the shelf. The shelf is a simple construction and only requires these 5 pieces. I used my miter shears to cut a standard popsicle stick into 2 shelves. I used a medium stick for the side and a jumbo stick for the top. I prefer less overhang for the top shelf, so I used an 1/8 inch wide coffee stir stick and marked a line and cut the excess off. After a quick sanding, I think that looks a lot better. I'm using a hole punch to add detail to the plain sides. I punched a hole in the center and then a hole on either side that's a little lower than the center hole. Then I traced the pattern onto the other side piece to make sure they match. These are all the pieces and their dimensions. Since I'm making this shelf to display this jar, I put it in place to make sure it will fit on the top shelf. Then I drew a couple lines marking where the popsicle stick meets the side. I'm using the lines I drew as a guide so I can center a new hole punch pattern between the shelves. Even if you choose to leave your sides plain, it's still a great shelf. But I really like the added detail and I think it better displays the pieces when there's bulk removed from the sides. These 5 pieces are the top, the sides, and the shelves. Now I'm ready to stain the wood pieces. I'm staining a popsicle stick and a medium popsicle stick to make the wooden back later. First, I brush on a coat of full-strength acrylic paint. Then I use a paper towel to wipe off the excess. I'm using tweezers to hold the pieces so I can paint each side at the same time to reduce the risk of the thin wood warping. I'm staining the wood before assembly because glue repels paint and I don't want any messy glue marks. Once the paint dried, I used a side piece as a guide to mark the pieces I cut for the back. You could also use cereal box as the back of your shelf and paint it a different color or even add wallpaper. To make my back symmetrical, I used the standard stick in the middle and the medium sticks on the sides. I used wood glue to attach each side of the shelf. I cleaned up the excess glue using a coffee stir stick. I added wood glue to 3 sides of the popsicle stick shelf and installed it before the 2 side pieces dried so I could open them up and then squeeze them back together. While the glue was still wet, I adjusted the shelves to make sure they're level. Then I finished it off by gluing on the top. While that's drying, we'll get started on one of the accessories to decorate the shelf. I'm using creative paperclay to make some simple bread. I started with a round ball and I made sure that it fit on the shelf. Then I made it slightly more square and used a dental tool to make some indents around the edges. I softened the indent and added some texture using a cheap toothbrush from the Dollar Tree. I used some crumpled up aluminum foil to make some indents on the top of the bread. This can be called done right here, but to make the air dry clay dry a little faster, I used my dental tool to poke a hole in the bottom. I set that aside to dry and I'll give it a very simple paint job later to finish it off. The popsicle stick shelf is dry and it looks fantastic. It could absolutely be called finished here, but I want the wood to look dry and old, so I'm using a bit of cream paint and doing some dry brushing. If you're not familiar with how to do this technique, I made a paint techniques video that I'll link in the description. The popsicle sticks we started with have come a long way, and I think the shelf is ready for some accessories. Once the clay is no longer cold to the touch, it's ready for paint. I did a very simple paint job that anyone can replicate. I watered down some brown paint and painted the top, the sides, and the bottom, and then removed the excess paint. The first coat of paint that I wiped away provided a base color. Then I added another layer of the same brown paint to the top and bottom so they'll be darker than the sides. The paint only takes a moment to dry and it looks like a wheat roll. But to give the look of flour, I used some off-white paint and did a little bit of dry brushing on the top and on the sides. I used some Fabri-Tac glue to glue some brown paper bag onto the bottom shelf. I tore the edges of the bag so there wouldn't be clean cut lines. This is where I'll glue the bread. I used a bit of matte Mod Podge to glue down some baking soda so it'll look like flour underneath my bread. Cornstarch would look better for this, but I was all out. You could use baby powder or white chalk pastel if you want to avoid using food products. With the bread sorted out, I dug through my stash of miniature books to find a couple shallow books that will fit on my popsicle stick shelf. One of the books I chose is weathered and I love that look, so I'm going to replicate it using my emery board. I used my nail file to sand the corners and the edges of the book so it'll look a lot older. I glued the taller book to the side of the shelf so it'll stand straight up. And I glued the green book at a slight angle so it'll look more natural on the shelf and be more interesting. I'm adding a small towel to the shelf since this is going in the kitchen, so I chose a couple options of fabric that fray nicely and settled on this one. After trimming off a small rectangular piece, I pulled some of the threads to add more fraying and used Fabri-Tac to glue it into place. I prefer this method rather than shaping it beforehand because it's faster and easier and looks more natural on the shelf. I'd like to display this plastic pan, but I don't like the shiny metal on this rustic shelf. To transform this simple plastic pan and make it look like cast iron, I start out by sanding it. Then I mixed a little bit of black acrylic paint into some matte Mod Podge. The Mod Podge helps the black paint stick to the plastic surface, but it'll still scratch easily, so I wouldn't use it on a miniature you'll be handling very much. 2 coats of paint later, I've transformed my plastic pan into cast iron. I'm all about that grime, so I used a little bit of brown chalk pastels to make the towel look used and dirty. Then I used some Fabri-Tac to glue the pan into place. In a future video, I'll show you how I made this canning jar filled with green olives. I dug through my stash of canning jars to find something else to adorn the top shelf. I also added this vintage bowl. I think it's made out of plaster and I really like the cracks in it. I grabbed another jar from my stash and used this mint jelly to fill this corner. This little shelf can be displayed on a wall, but it can also sit on a countertop or table. There are many opportunities to customize it depending on paint choices and if you put a wallpaper backing. I hope you make one of your own at home, and make sure to check out one of my other videos.